This week on the Debunking Economics podcast, is there such a thing as good debt and bad debt? Or is all debt bad, which is what I think my dad tried to teach me? Or is all debt good because it gets us spending? And if it's a bit of both, what's good and what's bad? Well, let's assume that is the case and try and define what is good for us and what is damaging the economy. That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. So look, there's a lot online and in magazines and newspapers about good versus bad debt, but obviously these are things which are written from a consumer finance point of view, telling you the bleeding obvious, really, that, you know, credit card debt is bad debt because it costs so much and it becomes a death spiral. We all know that. But what about which debt is good or bad for the economy? So, and we know quite a bit about that, Steve, because we've spoken about this so much in the past. We know government debt is better than private debt because government debt could be covered with created money. Bonds can be issued and bought by central banks through quantitative easing and the like. And we've seen quite a bit of that lately, and we're likely to see more of it again, I suspect. Bad debt, we know, is private sector debt because if it keeps rising, it can create asset bubbles which will burst at some point, such as Australian housing, for example. But at its simplest level, if you lend me some money, I mean, it really doesn't change much, does it, really? If you give me some money, I've got some money to spend, you don't. When I pay it back, you've got the money to spend. It doesn't impact the economy in any way at all, does it, if it's just between the two of us?
Well, it does in the sense, I'm experiencing that right now, in that what you get is less demand coming out of it when it's peer-to-peer lending, because you're not creating an additional credit to begin with. And yes, somebody else getting borrowed money reduces the spending power of the lender, and you have constraints, credit constraints, which can hit both parties. So it's really, in terms of the good versus bad, that I'm focusing more on what the financial sector does. And in that case, I think the worst debt is household debt for buying houses, because that's what's caused the asset bubbles we have. But
the example, that we've talked about in the past is you've lent some money to your sister. You've got she's using it to invest in her business. So her business is growing as a result of that. So she's, helping create some wealth for her. You're out of pocket for it for now, but when she gives the money back to you, then you've got that money to spend. It's just a time lag effect, isn't it? But she's benefited from that in the meantime because her business has grown as a result of it.
She has. I mean, she got a $75,000 a year cash flow she wouldn't have had otherwise. And, into that cash flow, then she could finance me back if she could borrow the money to finance me back. But, as I've explained in a couple of podcasts a couple of posts for patrons, that hasn't happened because of all things. The Royal Commission exposed how badly banks had been lending to superannuation firms through which she'd actually arranged the business, and they won't lend to superannuation firms, so she can't pay me back. So, we're well and truly constrained. So it's given me an interesting angle on the good versus bad debt story, because as well, I'm on the advisory board for Positive Money UK, and Positive Money favours effectively abolishing the capacity of banks to create money. And I'm ambivalent for a number of reasons, because I think that what banks should be doing is providing working capital to existing corporations and finance for entrepreneurs. And in the case of my sister's loan from me, that should have been a bank loan, which in this would have been like a loan of, say, 700,000 Australian dollars that would have enabled her to develop 2 blocks of land that would have generated $150,000 per year of income. And that we well and truly know that now, because like her current business is 100% occupied, and she has existing demand for half as many sites as she actually has. Is a storage facility. So it would have worked domestically, and therefore there would have been a debt of, say, $700,000 generated by the local branch of a well-functioning private bank, and that would have meant, Lisa, drop me a cup of coffee here, mates. Pardon me.
That's all right. That's all right.
Okay.
Pick up.
Yeah, that would have meant $700,000 of debt, generating $150,000 per year worth of income, which would have, if they were charged the interest at say 5%, that would have been $35,000 out of $150,000. The bank would have made a nice living. My sister would have been making a nice living, and it'd be a larger local economy than there otherwise would be.
And would that money from the bank, would that be money that the bank had created, or would that be simply the bank repurposing money that had been given to it as a deposit?
The bank that had created the money. This is the thing. The creation of credit, when it then enables a business to operate, can give you a viable economy. You don't have to have interest overwhelming the economy. This is, I've done.
So Roy Langston, the reason I brought this up, we were talking about this today, is because Roy Langston, one of our listeners, says that, because you'd said just this before, that banks should be able to create money if it enables productive capacity or for somebody to start a business. But his point is, shouldn't that money basically be funded from someone's savings rather than the bank creating it? He says if the banks issue the debt, he says that's at odds with your call for a debt jubilee. We only need debt jubilees because banksters, he says, I like that term, I'm going to use that more, banksters always issue too much debt in the first place.
This is an interesting question about what jubilees actually were for, because if you look at Michael Hudson's research and David Graeber's and so on, Cornelia Wunsch in the very first instance, what they found was the jubilees were against household debt. They weren't against business debt. Now, if you go way away, this is talking historically, looking at the earlier Sumerian civilizations, when there was household debt, often it was incurred, and this is quite amazing, but I think
because it's not speculative. Is that
well,
the
not
issue?
Just that. A lot of the debt was incurred in ale houses, because you would be actually drinking in the ale house, not able to pay for it. Borrow it and then find the harvest wasn't what you expected. So it became.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I was thinking, the money that you gave to your sister, which she can start a business with. I think that's a good use of that money, because you're in Amsterdam. You would have just smoked it all away, wouldn't you?
That's dead right. Yeah. Yeah, good. Very funny, mate. You'll pay for that one later. But yeah, it's making productive use out of money which is sitting idle. And that's why I first offered it to her, because I had 1.2 million in my super. I didn't need it. I was earning a full-time salary. She had blocks of land she couldn't develop. But it would be better, you're saying, if the bank had done it, if the bank had created that money, and you don't see a problem with that. That doesn't sit aside from your debt jubilee, because it's not household debt that we're talking about. Let's talk about what are the mechanics there, because again, even though I have modeled, that my original Minsky model was a business borrowing, which specifically was creating extra physical resources for productive use, nonetheless could have a debt collapse. So that's the stylized model I did of Minsky back in 1992. Showing that if you had capitalist desire to invest being low, then you could reach what we call a good equilibrium with a lower rate of growth, and you'd otherwise get a low level of investment. If you had a higher desire to invest, what you actually got would be a runaway debt bubble, and that's what we actually experienced. So I've modeled the financial crisis with what you might call good debt occurring. So even good debt can get you in a bad situation. But if you look at the bubbles that have occurred throughout history, what's been the actual outcome, then it's normally been borrowing for land. Even the Great Depression, the 1920s, which we call the Roaring Twenties still. Richard Vague's research on that, which of course I highly recommend people read, Richard's new book, A Brief History of Doom, by going right back to original source documents, he has shown that a large part of the bubble of the 1920s was actually a real estate bubble.
So there we go. Again, bad debt creates asset bubbles, but that raises the question, which we feature in this longer discussion about whether just letting banks create money just adds to that asset bubble. So is all good debt good or bad? Is it a bit of a mix? And what is good and bad? We spend quite a bit of time on this, so if you want to hear the full discussion, you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen and pledge $10 or more support to his work each month, and you get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. Hopefully we'll see you back here again soon. I'm Phil Dobbie. Catch you next time.